It really is like something out of a fairy tale. I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm in Mont Saint-Michel, France, exploring the history and all of the museums of this fascinating island fortress church. With a history dating back to the year 708 and a swoon-worthy village winding its way up the rock, Mont Saint-Michel, sometimes called Jerusalem in the Sky, is a tourist heaven located on the Norman side of the border between Brittany and Normandy. That's in the northwest of France. It's such a beautiful place. And you won't just encounter eager foreigners like me here. This is a top destination for domestic tourists as well, not to mention pilgrims who arrive on foot. After all, the pictures simply don't do it justice. You need to come here in person. In addition to visiting the Abbey, which was originally founded 1,300 years ago, there are also 4 museums here on the island for you to visit. Admission to one museum costs €9, and you could purchase a joint ticket to all 4 for $18. I'll be interspersing some of the museum content throughout this video to illustrate the history of the island, but there will also be a dedicated overview of each of the 4 museums towards the end of the video. Viewing Mont Saint-Michel from any angle can be almost disorienting. It rises like a rocky crag on top of the island, a true architectural feat. We can see here just how vertical it is. It rises straight up, requiring complex architecture and a series of vaults and pillars to hold the whole thing up, and we'll enter those vaults a little bit later on. I don't say this lightly, but this really does remind me of a fairy tale, a real-life Christmas ornament, or something straight out of a fantasy land in an amusement park. I mean, it was used as the inspiration for the Kingdom of Corona and the castle in Disney's animated film Tangled, so I'm not too far off. I kept humming the song Belle from Beauty and the Beast as we wandered around. Since I was here overnight, you're going to notice 2 very different weather conditions in this video, but just look at how beautiful this morning was. If you're new to my channel, welcome. So lovely to have you here. And if you're a returning viewer and you're interested in watching even more content every month, like dedicated videos, and even getting invitations to in-person tours, head over to my Patreon. Over there, my patrons get access to an additional video tour every single month. So I hope to see you there. Now, before we get into our tour of the island and its abbey and museums, I wanted to share some of my personal experiences here staying on Mont Saint-Michel. A little bit of a travel vlog. While you can do this as a day trip, and indeed most people do, I highly recommend staying the night here if you can. Let's just put it this way. Here are some of the scenes from when we arrived at 3 p.m. versus later that evening around 8 p.m. And then again here on the empty Rampart walkway around 8 a.m. the next morning before the tour groups arrived. You can really see a difference. It was so special to be here and have it almost to ourselves. We stayed one night at the Auberge Saint-Pierre, and it was a perfectly lovely little 3-star hotel. But this was the big selling feature. By the way, that's my husband and my mom there in the window. I'm standing over on the ramparts. As you can see behind the hotel, there are a series of small steep staircases that lead up from the main road to the Abbey, or you can take a more gradual winding road to the top. For dinner, we ate at the famous Mère Poulard, named after this woman, Anne Bouteille Poulard. Here she is depicted in a reenactment in a video in the Maritime Museum, and she was a cook and an innkeeper here in the 19th century, and she specialized in these famous omelettes. You'll see them in every restaurant on the island. They're puffy and buttery and cooked over a wood fire. Now, they were developed to be a quick and easy starter for tourists and pilgrims. Numbers were hard to predict due to the changing tides, but Mère Poulard and her husband kept enough eggs on hand for the crowds. Today, this restaurant goes through 450,000 eggs a year. Now, you can see that a lot of notable people have eaten here, including presidents and royals. Somehow I managed to get seated below Margaret Thatcher. Now, did I realize how pricey these omelets were when I booked here? No. It's a special meal, but these are the originals, and this was fabulous with some coquilles Saint-Jacques, another Norman specialty. If you don't feel like splashing out, most restaurants offer these omelets for around €15. Finally, let me just show you how to get on and off the island. After you park or arrive on a bus, you queue up to hop on one of these shuttles called navettes. They take you for free to the island, or you can walk from this point, and it's about a 35-minute walk across the bridge. On the mainland, there's a clutch of shops, fast food, and some hotels. I guess the benefit of staying here is that you do get this view from your lodgings. By the way, the bridge was completed in 2014, and it helps to keep tourism operating smoothly. It replaces a late 19th century causeway, dam, and kind of infill situation that prevented the tides from flowing naturally around the island. I was shocked to find out that the tides around Mont Saint-Michel are known for being some of the highest in Europe. They can have a difference of up to 15 meters, that's almost 50 feet, between the low and high tide. Scarily, especially for someone caught up in the mucky sand, the sea can retreat up to 15 kilometers and return quickly. So for about 20 days a year, Mont Saint-Michel is actually an island once again. That is, it's not connected by the road. The tides around the solstice period actually rise high enough that the island is surrounded by water. I think that would be a really cool time to come. Now let's head over to the island, and I want to tell you all about the origins of this place and why we're here. The island and the Abbey's stories are really intertwined. It all starts back in the year 708. Bishop Aubert, who was the bishop of nearby Avranches, had 3 visions of the Archangel Michael. Saint Michael is said to have asked him to build a sanctuary in his honor on an island called Maritime. That's the island now. However, Aubert ignored the visions at first, believing them to be demonic. The archangel returned and reputedly burned a hole in Aubert's skull with his finger. I mean, that's one way to get someone to listen. We can see his dream depicted here on this tympanum in one of the staircases. Aubert was later canonized to become Saint Aubert. Here's his skull at his shrine in Saint Gervais Basilica in Avranches. This hole is often cited as proof of the archangel's insistent poking, but others say it likely shows evidence of trepanation, that is, drilling a hole in your head to relieve pressure and commune with God. Always with the trepanation on my channel. Aubert built the first monastic settlement and a small church here soon after. You can see some of the construction phases in this rather retro laser show at Archeoscope, one of the 4 museums on the island, and we'll come back to this later on. And here is another illustration of the series of different architectural phases. However, when Saint Aubert and the early ascetics who lived here saw this as a place of piety and pilgrimage, it is also located in a very strategically important area. And as an island off the coast of France in the English Channel, well, many wars have been fought here. After all, the name Normandy comes from the settlement of the territory by Vikings, i.e. the Norsemen, starting in the 9th century. In 933, Viking William Longsword annexed this region from a weakened Duchy of Brittany. And then in 966, Duke Richard I of Normandy installed Benedictine monks on the mount, that is, monks who followed the way of Saint Benedict. In 1023, those monks began working on a Romanesque church. By the way, Romanesque means architecture influenced by the past glory of Rome. This is a phase just before the Gothic architecture took over in the early medieval period. Any invaders would have to deal with the rising and falling tides of the island, and what is often referred to as quicksand. Now, this muck isn't true quicksand, but it can trap you and hold you captive as the tides quickly rise around you. In fact, this is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, which I also visited on this trip. I'll be making a video about that majestic story in a few months' time, but here is where they cross over. You can see Harold Godwinson rescuing some of William the Conqueror's knights out of the dangerous sand, with the then newly built Romanesque abbey just behind them. This was during the Breton-Norman War. By 1067, the monastery at Mont Saint-Michel supported William the Conqueror's claim to the English throne. When he was successful, he rewarded the monks here with properties and grounds on the English side of the Channel. This included a small island off the southwestern coast of Cornwall near Penzance. This is called St. Michael's Mount, and let me know if you'd be interested in a video here. Mont Saint-Michel soon became one of the most popular places of pilgrimage throughout the Christian West, along with Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome, as people came to ask St. Michael for protection and salvation of their souls. The island's location, just a few hundred meters from the mainland, made it accessible at low tide for the many pilgrims who wanted to see the site where the archangel visited Saint Aubert. Here in the Abbey, monks worked tirelessly to produce, preserve, and study a large number of manuscripts. This was one of the main centers of culture during the medieval period, owing to its location here between England and France. Again, it was known as Jerusalem in the sky. We're going to come back to this topic when we tour the scriptorium in the Abbey. It wasn't just average people or pious ascetics who came here on pilgrimage. Mont Saint-Michel Abbey received some pretty important pilgrims, kings and queens of France and England, including Saint Louis. I talk all about him in my Notre Dame video, as well as Louis XI, Anne of Brittany, King Francis I, and King Henry II, the Plantagenet king who had also done some hardcore repenting in Canterbury for his role in St. Thomas Becket's murder. I'll be making a video about that soon. However, remember, as important as it was for religious reasons, it was also a strategic boon. The abbey was fortified by the Duchy of Normandy during the 100 Years' War with England. Its powerful ramparts, today thronged with tourists taking in the beautiful views of the abbey, helped the island resist. The mount was besieged by the English in 1423 and emerged victorious in 1434. At this point, it began to be used as a symbol of victory for the Kingdom of France. However, these wars caused great damage. In 1421, the Romanesque choir of the church collapsed. It was rebuilt a century later in the flamboyant Gothic style. For the next few centuries, Mont Saint-Michel was once again one of the most important sites of pilgrimage in Europe. We can see these pilgrims' badges in the Historic Museum, some of them unearthed from tombs and burials here on the island. Pilgrims' badges were essentially souvenirs for pilgrims to wear on their shirt or hat to show others that they had been to a holy site. However, pilgrimages began to slow down in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Reformation led to a loss of interest in saint worship, and the fate of the island was up in the air. The monks, who were now Maurists, that is, they followed the more intellectual and academic Benedictine tradition of Saint Maur, had a new set of duties. They had to take care of the prisoners imprisoned by lettres de cachet. These were demands of the king, literally letters of the sign, to jail people without trial and with no appeals. You should never jail people with no trial. They were mainly drunkards, troublemakers, prostitutes, squanderers of the family fortune, and/or insane persons. Now, here is where things get really hairy, because of course, we have to contend with the French Revolution. As we learned in my Notre Dame video, the revolutionaries often converted churches and other religious sites to temples of reason, or even had them destroyed. Mont Saint-Michel was nationalized, and the clergy and the monks were driven out of the abbey. The abbey, once so beloved and treasured, was fully converted to a prison and nicknamed the Bastille of the Seas. The first prisoners incarcerated here were the monks who refused to abandon their faith and religious practice. Ironically, at that time, Mont Saint-Michel was called the Free Mount, Mont Libre. We can see some of the damage here. This relief of Saint Aubin and Archangel Michael was defaced, literally, when the island fortress was a prison. Over the next few decades, the abbey was really deteriorating, and there was a lot of concern about its future. That said, despite the damage, its use as a prison prevented it from being destroyed completely. In 1836, influential figures, including Victor Hugo, bolstered by his recent successes championing Notre Dame's restoration, launched a campaign to restore Mont Saint-Michel. The prison here finally closed in 1863, and architect Édouard Courrier began assessing the abbey's condition in 1872. Courrier was a student of Eugène Vier-le-Duc, who you might also remember from my Notre Dame video. While Vier-le-Duc wasn't actually involved with the restoration of Mont Saint-Michel, Courrier carefully followed his restoration philosophy. Courrier went on to write 4 books about this process and called it La Merveille, the wonder or the marvel. We have him to thank for its current good condition. When France was occupied by Germany in World War II, they used the Abbey as a lookout and also welcomed German tourists and soldiers. Mont Saint-Michel and the entire bay were added to the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites about a year after that list was created in 1978. It was listed with criteria such as cultural, historical, and architectural significance, as well as human-created and natural beauty. So basically, it checks all of the boxes. Okay, now we've explored the history of the Abbey and the island, but let's actually walk through each part of the Abbey now and talk about its daily life, construction, and architecture over the last 1,300 years. Here we are on the terrace, looking out over the river and the bay. Standing here, I can see one of the most famous details of the structure, the golden statue of the Archangel Michael. This was designed in 1894 by sculptor Emmanuel Fremier. There's actually this replica of it at the Musée d'Orsay. It's 3 meters tall, that's about 10 feet, gilded in gold, and weighs 520 kilos, that's over 1,000 pounds. We can see Michael is ready to strike an evil dragon with his sword. I love the fact that this is the island's main lightning rod. Lightning is drawn to the end of the Archangel's sword and wings, which is both practical but also very poetic. Look down at my feet. We can see these different numbers and letters. These aren't some secret code. These are actually mason's marks to help specific stonecutters get paid for their work. We can see that the gate of the church is composed of a square and a circle. That's common in Benedictine churches. The square is the symbol of humans' aim to perfection, and the circle is the symbol of God's perfection. It has 3 doors, symbolizing the Holy Trinity, the Lord, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. We'll come back to numbers and 3s a bit later on. Let's step inside the nave. Here we have this lovely maquette. The French love a maquette. There's one in every important building. This really helps us to see the impressive construction of this building, which is characterized by 2 architectural styles. Remember, the Romanesque and the Gothic. Here in the nave and the transept, we are surrounded by the Romanesque architecture of 1023, but the choir and the chapels date from the Gothic period a few hundred years later, after the Romanesque choir collapsed in 1421. This took a full century and was completed in 1521. The older 11th century parts of the structure were designed by William of Volpiano, an Italian architect who also built Fécamp Abbey in Normandy. Now, he was gutsy. He placed the transept crossing at the top of the mount, which seems to defy gravity and physics. In order to support the massive weight of this structure, essentially balanced on a point, he also had to build many underground crypts and chapels to compensate for the weight, like these here that we're going to come back to. Look here, we see rather plain windows. Sadly, the magnificent Gothic stained glass was lost or destroyed during the French Revolution. Masses are still celebrated here 3 times a day, except on Mondays, and there is still a small religious community of 6 monks and 6 nuns who live here. However, they live in more modern lodgings adjacent to the abbey. Let's step outside here to the cloisters. Now, these are rather small cloisters, but they are a true wonder within the wonder, balanced between sky and sea. Cloisters are covered walkways that serve as places for monks and nuns to meditate, get fresh air, and exercise without leaving the confines of the abbey. Let's have a look here at this glass wall that gives us such a dramatic perspective out to the bay and the craggy rocks below. Here, there was an entrance to the walkway to a chapter house. A chapter house was to be built in the extension of the cloister to replace the one that had collapsed, but it never happened. Look out the small windows. This also served as a covered garden, allowing the clergy to grow medicinal herbs and vegetables. The cloister is trapezoidal in shape and consists of a garden and a covered gallery. This colonnade has 137 columns arranged in staggered rows. This is an ingenious way to support the heavy roof of the cloister, as the tripod is a very sturdy structure, and the number 3, remember, as we saw with the gate, is symbolic to the Holy Trinity. 7 is symbolic to the 7 days of the week, and there are 21 arches, which also represents 3 and 7, as well as 37 small columns. The entire structure of Mont Saint-Michel has 7 towers and 3 doors. There are symbols everywhere. Remember, we already saw the damaged statues here earlier, but there are more on the ceiling. Here we can see a sculpture of a lamb, a pilgrim's stick, and a gated town. This represents Rouen. The lamb is the symbol of Rouen, that city, because they specialized in textiles for centuries. My toddler delighted in saying "ba, ba" as we walked around Rouen, because there are pictures of sheep everywhere. There's another sculpture on the ceiling. It is a dragon and grapes. This represents the Benedictine motto, in medio stat virtus. Virtue is in moderation, or literally, virtue lies in between the extremes. A little bit of wine is good, but too much leads to evil, represented by the fierce dragon. Okay, now we're in the refectory, the dining hall where monks ate their meals. Sometimes they did get 3 meals a day, other times it was just 1 or even none during times of fasting. They would often have a modest breakfast at 6:30 a.m. and then perform the Lauds prayer at 7. After Eucharisty at 11:45, they may have a small lunch and then an evening meal at 7:45 p.m. The monks ate here in silence as prayers and biblical passages were read aloud. The monks ate a very simple diet. Benedictines take a vow of poverty, so their food is meant to be adequate but quite bland. Here at Mont Saint-Michel, they ate a lot of vegetables, but they stayed away from root vegetables because those were grown beneath the ground and were therefore closer to hell. Instead, they ate peas, leeks, cabbage, and a lot of fish, especially on Fridays. Meat was thought to give them too much energy that they did not need for their lives of study and prayer, but they did eat poultry once a year on Christmas. The wooden ceilings come from the Viking traditions of shipbuilding. Here you can see a model of it. Many Norse invaders to this coast in the 9th and 10th centuries later used their boats as the roofs of their houses, and later on for their churches. Also, this wooden roof is much lighter than a stone roof. Remember that the building stands on a rock, itself on sand, so a wooden roof just makes sense. Okay, now we're entering the guest hall. Important members of society, such as dukes, barons, and yes, even kings, could use this room when they came to Mont Saint-Michel on pilgrimage. Society was very divided at the time, so no one wanted for the plebs to accidentally meet with the nobility. There was no causeway or bridge back then. Even the rich, who might have made the long journey on horseback or in a coach, were meant to take the last symbolic steps on foot, possibly even barefoot. Of course, the richer the pilgrim, the larger their retinue. They would be accompanied by staff, as well as their furniture, tapestries, lavish clothing, and the cooking vessels for the whole group. Check out these massive fireplaces. You can imagine a nice sheep or boar turning on a spit here, surrounded by many pots of sauces and stews. There also used to be an earthenware chimney in the center of the room to heat the space, but it was stolen or damaged during the French Revolution. This room could also accommodate many beds, as well as large tubs like this one in the Historic Museum for bathing. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people bathed regularly and placed cleanliness next to godliness. However, public bathhouses were closed during plague outbreaks in the 17th century and they never really reopened, leading to a misconstrued idea that bathing was somehow bad for you. It was believed later that it would open your pores too much and allow sickness to seep in, but earlier in the medieval period, bathing was regular. Here we're now in the scriptorium. In this room, monks wrote, copied, and illuminated, that is, illustrated, manuscripts about theology, mathematics, history, and philosophy. Mont Saint-Michel was known as La Cité des Livres, the city of books, because of the volume of high-quality books produced here. The monks also made the paper, blended the inks, and crafted feather quills and other writing tools. The cheapest paper was made from pork skin, while the most expensive, sheepskin, was known as vellum. It would take around 1 year to produce one book at this time, so books were precious, rare, and expensive. Buying a book on your pilgrimage to Mont Saint-Michel was a way to show off your wealth and success. People back at home would be wowed and impressed by such a souvenir. The books produced here were colored red and green. Every abbey of note in Europe that produced books had their own colors. The large windows here allowed a lot of light to stream in, so the monks could focus on writing out the tiny letters. If you want to see more of the books produced here, you can head about a 30-minute drive away to Avranches. There, the Scriptorial Museum houses one of the world's largest collections of medieval books, many over 1,000 years old. So let me know if you're interested in a video on that topic. I'd love to visit. I do actually already have one similar video. For my Patreon channel, I made a 1-hour video tour about the British Library's medieval women. We're now descending into the crypt. It's called the Crypt of the Great Pillars, and great they really are. They're huge. This crypt is part of the 11th century build, but back then, these were much smaller pillars. After the collapse of the Romanesque choir in 1421, the granite pillars were built to encase them to ensure the stability of the abbey, and these are 5 meters in diameter. That's about 15 feet. Starting around that time, the crypt began to be used as a torture chamber. Under King Louis XI, now he was nicknamed the Universal Spider. For his control over society, he spun webs of conspiracies and plots against his perceived enemies. He used to bring people here to undergo questioning. That involved putting his prisoners in hanging cages. Many of them were Lutheran, aka the Huguenots. They were French Protestants, and many ended up here in this room. This may be a beautiful place to admire the light vaulted ceilings and Gothic architecture, but it really is a place of dark history. By the way, the 2 thinner columns holding up the high altar are called the palm trees in reference to Palm Sunday. Let's now head into the monks' ossuary. Straight ahead, we can see this massive wheel. This was built in 1820 to bring food and water all the way up for the prisoners of the Mont. It was literally used as a giant kind of hamster wheel. 1 of 2 prisoners would get in and they would use it to bring up the necessary food and water. The workers walking slowly in these wheels were nicknamed squirrels. I love that. Now, let's have a look into this deep hole. This was the monks' ossuary. There was no room here in the abbey to bury deceased monks, so only the abbots were buried in the village graveyard. For the rest of the monks, they would simply be dropped into this hole and then covered with quicklime. That would dry out the flesh and tissue to remove the smell and prevent insects and rodents. Now, the monks weren't super precious about their mortal remains because remember, their souls would be escorted to heaven by Archangel Michael. On that note, a very fitting one, we're now leaving the abbey. Let's head to the village before we go to the museums. Now, so far we've been talking about the history of the abbey and the construction of the island fortress itself, but let's take a few minutes to admire these small lanes and the streets that make up the village. As we have seen throughout this video, tourism has been a big industry here since the Middle Ages, as pilgrims made their way to the island. However, when the island was converted into a prison, the inmates' relatives would also come here, and later, artists began to arrive, inspired by the natural and built beauty. The Impressionists loved Normandy, and look at this piece by pointillist Paul Signac, and this 1832 piece by Théodore Rousseau. When the prison finally closed, more and more tourists began to arrive, and the first of the museums was opened. You can tell they have a very old-timey vibe. However, it was the construction of the causeway and dam in 1879 that really saw tourism explode. The annual number of tourists was 30,000 in 1885, but 100,000 by 1910. Many of these buildings lining the Grande Rue, the main street in town, were built at that point. Today, Mont Saint-Michel receives more than 3 million visitors each year, making it the most visited tourist attraction in France outside of Paris. In the 18th century, around 300 people lived here permanently, but today it's only 30, that's right, 30, who actually live on the Mont. Everybody else who works here takes the island road and the shuttles on and off the island to go to and from work. Remember, to avoid the crowds, stay the night, and you really will have the streets to yourself. Okay, look here. This tiny lane is called Cuckold's Alley. Apparently the name is given because someone wearing the cuckold's horns wouldn't be able to walk through. Now, both figuratively and literally throughout history, cuckolds, that is, people who don't realize that their spouses are cheating on them, have been associated with horns. Some people say that this is because animals don't realize that they have horns, and again, people being cheated on often don't realize that this is the case. Now, somebody wearing the horns couldn't make it down this tiny, narrow alley, and trust me, it was really tiny. So throughout the course of the video, I have actually shown you some footage of the 4 different museums here on the island to help illustrate the historic aspects of the topic. However, there was a lot more going on that I want to show you, so let's do a little tour of the museums. They are the Maritime Museum, the Logis Tiphaine, the Historical Museum, and the Archeoscope. So let's start with the Archeoscope. This is the most recent of the museums, and it does feel dated. It features this laser show, as well as a 15-minute video that includes a model of Mont Saint-Michel rising from a reflecting pool. While the show is in French, you can easily use a QR code to access English narration on your phone. This one's fun. If you're going to do the 4-museum pass, I recommend it, but I don't think you should do this one on its own. Next, I visited the Maritime Museum. While they claimed I would learn about the powerful and rare Mont Saint-Michel tides here, I must have missed something. I didn't see much about the tides, but instead the 3 floors of the museum were filled with model ships of all sizes, some up to 400 years old and from all different time periods, including some that are quite recent. You can have a look at the different ones here. The museum also shows a short dramatized documentary. Now, I admit I didn't watch the whole thing, so maybe that's where the title information here, but look, here's Mère Poulard making her omelets. For the 3rd museum, I trudged up the hill to the Logis Tiphaine. Now, this one was pretty cool. You walk through the 3 stories of a stone house that belonged to medieval knight Bertrand du Guesclin and his wife, the astrologer Tiphaine de Raguenel. Yes, you heard me correctly. She was an astrologer in the 1300s. Here she is with her telescope. This was at a time that most women interested in such esoteric and academic pursuits would be suspected of witchcraft, but Tiphaine was so pious and sweet that everyone allowed her to be an academic. I knew I was reminded of Beauty and the Beast while I was walking through town. Now, she was married to Bertrand du Guesclin, Constable of France, who made a name for himself during the 100 Years' War. He was paranoid about her safety while he was away fighting, so he had this mansion built for her here because it was one of the most fortified and protected strongholds in the kingdom. While he fought on the battlefields, she stayed here and read the stars, predicting his successes and endearing herself to the local villagers, but not endearing herself too much. See, Guesclin made her wear this chastity belt when he was away. You can see that there are openings for her bodily functions, but they are not wide enough for her to get away with any shenanigans with other men. As crowded as the island is right now, it's really nice to have these museums to myself. I just want to bring up the Tiffany problem here. It was first coined by author Nicola Cornick in 2018. See, the name Tiphaine or Tiffany, a name for girls in medieval England and France. However, if you were to actually use the name Tiffany or even Tiphaine in a medieval novel, for instance, the audience would probably perceive it as inaccurate, associating the name with the 1980s. I don't know, for me, the Tiffany problem, I always think of Justin. I know Justin's an ancient name, but to me, I just think of like a kid in my elementary school. Now, this is the view from the walkway between the Logis Tiphaine and the Historic Museum, which they're almost connected, but you have to walk through this garden. Finally, I visited the Historical Museum, located at the base of the Abbey and home to artifacts that trace the 1300 years of Mont Saint-Michel's history, including these medieval torture instruments. Really serious. You can check out all these shackles and manacles, muskets and guns, paintings and pilgrims' badges. This 1909 sculpture by Paul Capellini depicts a recurring theme on the island. This is the enlisé dans le sable mouvant, that is, a man caught in the quicksand. Check out these boots to traverse the muck or the quicksand. These date to the 17th century. Wow, I just love this view. There's always something so poetic about capturing a view through doors or a window. I guess it's all about unexplored possibilities. Next is this beautiful garden, which overlooks the churchyard at the tiny St. Aubin church and graveyard. And it's home to one of only 5 functioning periscopes left in the world. Sadly, it was not in operation when I visited. The next section of the museum includes an array of wax figures acting out macabre scenes. Now, this was very, medieval times. It was really dark and actually quite hard to walk through until my eyes adjusted to the light. A disembodied voice kind of booms at you in French. I couldn't quite understand what was happening here. I think it was about the construction of the Abbey. This was, again, a lost opportunity to include more interpretation, more information about the subject at hand. There were a lot of wax figures in this section, as well as this tableau of monks in the Abbey, which appears a lot bigger than it actually is due to a clever use of mirrors. See examples of medieval monastic medical care. We can also see a reconstruction of the cells where prisoners were kept in the Abbey. This section really helps us better understand the living conditions in the, quote, Bastille of the Seas. This poor guy doesn't look too good, but here are some famous names. François Vincent Raspail was a biologist, doctor, and politician. He was heavily involved in politics after the Revolution of 1830. He was a staunch Republican, which means he wanted France to be a republic and not a monarchy. He was imprisoned many times throughout his lifetime, most famously here at Mont Saint-Michel during the reign of King Louis Philippe. After being released and then imprisoned and released again, he was eventually elected to minor office in this country. He did a lot of medical research, including treating other patients here at Mont Saint-Michel, and he was an early proponent of germ theory. And this is Armand Barbès. He too was imprisoned many times during his lifetime, and interestingly, Barbès and Raspail both have metro stations named after them. By the way, if the name Raspail sounds familiar, it might be from my Père Lachaise cemetery video. This unbelievable grave belongs to Madame Raspail, Francois' wife. This sculpture is meant to symbolize her overwhelming grief because she died while her husband was still a political prisoner. I've just linked that video above. Now, these guys aren't named, they're just some randos, but they show that the prisoners here carried out straw work for profit, well, for the prison's profit, making hats and chairs. Oh my goodness, this might actually be an oubliette. This is a specific type of dungeon, accessible only through a hole or hatch in the ceiling, and it comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. Now, if the first thing this made you think of was the movie Labyrinth, tell me you are an elder millennial without telling me you're an elder millennial. All jokes aside, though, an oubliette is absolutely terrifying. This is just essentially somewhere where you'd be put until you died. You can also see some beautiful carved wood here, as well as this really interesting corbel, I think, maybe a masthead, and interesting weapons. If you like cheesy wax museums, you'll like this, but honestly, you can probably skip it. If I had to choose one, I would go for the Logis Tiphaine, but even then, there is so much to see at the Abbey and the ambience to soak up on the island, as long as you're not here during peak tourist season, that you can probably skip these entirely. The museum guide suggesting that you skip the museums? Shocking, but true, I know. I really found myself yearning for a more modern museum that covered some of the more interesting aspects of the island in a clear and engaging way. While the museums are quaint, they really are dusty and outdated, and they don't do much to actually tell the story of this place. I really enjoyed some of these displays back over here on the mainland at the Tourist Information Centre. I think having a museum here would be a brilliant idea. I think this is a lost opportunity. Hey, Mont Saint-Michel, if you'd like to hire me as a consultant, I would definitely be available. But it's here that I will leave you with this beautiful view of Mont Saint-Michel. The museums may have left me a little bit underwhelmed, but my visit to this island and the Abbey certainly did not. They actually blew my expectations out of the water, pun intended. Well, that's the end of our tour, exploring the fascinating and really beautiful Mont Saint-Michel. Again, if you can swing it, I really do recommend spending the night here. It just allows you to experience the place without the throngs of tourists. Remember, this is one of the most visited places in France. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.